It's a pleasure to have an opportunity today to speak to the New Democratic Party's Opposition Day motion brought forward by the NDP House Leader, the Honourable Member for Burnaby New Westminster. And as I understand it, this motion proposes to amend Standing Order 11.2 to empower the Speaker to enforce the standing rules of relevance used in debates for answers given in question period. Currently, the standing order applies to debates on legislation and motion. I'm going to try and take my partisan hat off as much as possible, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to start by discussing what I believe to be each of our general responsibilities in this place as it pertains to debate and discourse. If you look on the Parliament of Canada website, it states that the Chamber is where members help to make Canada's laws by debating and voting on bills. The Chamber is a place where MPs can put local, regional, or national issues in the spotlight. They represent their constituents' views by presenting petitions, making statements, and asking questions in the House. And in late 2012, yourself, Speaker Scheer, made a ruling and, per a CBC article, stressed that holding governments to account is an indispensable privilege of elected MPs, and reminded the government House Leader that Canada has a parliamentary democracy, not a so-called executive democracy, nor a so-called administrative democracy. So there we have it, Mr. Speaker. The role of government is to hold members is to hold the government to account. And indeed, the government also has a responsibility to legislate and ensure that the government continues to operate. So, Mr. Speaker, how does the execution of these responsibilities work in practice? And I believe that the answer to that question is as varied as there are 308 members in this place. Because each of us bring our own approach to this responsibility, some more successfully than others, because it is our own individual responsibility to execute these here, and we should all be individually measured by our electorate, by our willingness and ability to do so. In this, the member has an individual responsibility to respect the level of debate in this place by providing thoughtful, understood content and reasoned arguments, and the elector has the right to measure our capability in doing so. This, Mr. Speaker, is at the heart of the principle of civic engagement. As an example, this morning I was asked by a reporter on my way into this place what I thought of this motion. I responded that I would comment once I had read the form and substance of it, as I hadn't at that time, and in that I'd form an opinion once I'd reviewed the content. After I read it, I expressed a desire to speak to this motion in the House today and formulated the content by myself of this intervention on the content that I'm delivering at present. This, Mr. Speaker, is how many of us approach interventions in this place. Last week, I spoke on Bill C-36 at report stage after speaking with several interested parties in my constituency and having read the testimony presented by witnesses at committees. There was a particular theme that I felt hadn't been adequately debated in the House, that our broader emerging cultural, not legal definition of sexual consent and how the variety of legislative options the Bedford ruling could present the House could potentially impact the same. I asked the Library of Parliament to complete some research for me and then spent several hours of personal time collating the information into an intervention, which I delivered. In another example earlier this year, the NDP presented the House with a motion which would effectively cut operating funding to the Senate for the remainder of the fiscal year. After reading this motion, I felt compelled to deliver an intervention in this place, and I argued that this motion should not be supported given how our country's governance model is set up. Bills would not pass and the wheels of government could grind to a halt, including those bills currently in front of the Senate put forward by NDP members. One of the biggest compliments of my parliamentary career came on that date, Mr. Speaker, when I had one opposition member come to me and state, "Your speech made me change my vote." When I was Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of the Environment, and now as Minister of State, I know it's my responsibility to understand my respective files to a degree where I can be prepared to debate and defend the government's positions on issues related to the same. I would argue, Mr. Speaker, that the majority of my Cabinet colleagues take this responsibility to heart and have demonstrated great competence in this regard. Many of my opposition colleagues also come well prepared to engage in meaningful debate as well. Occasionally on all sides of this House, this is not the case. However, Mr. Speaker, being prepared for debate, engaging in it, and preparing a rationed argument should be separated from the notion of putting forward a position that all parties here say they would like. In fact, a large pitfall of the role of a Member of Parliament, and for those who would put seeking approval over good sound policy, is that there are many who will disagree with your opinion. But you've put forward an opinion, and you've put forward policy to debate. A laudable goal in this place would be to use committee study and commons debate to sway position, to develop personal relationships that balance the theater which invariably accompanies politics with something that resembles work. And in my experience, Mr. Speaker, this happens far more often than it is reported on in the media. This goal needs to be further contextualized within the reality of our political system, as our political parties have positions on which these seek mandates, and indeed, we will disagree with one another here, and we will try to sway the public towards our position, as we believe that each of our respective policy stances are in the best interests of the country. This means at times, we will vociferously disagree with the content of each other's debate, but this doesn't mean that the content is automatically irrelevant. So let's carry this concept through to question period, wherein members have the direct opportunity to question government on its business and the core of today's motion. I believe that the heart of this motion is related to whether members have adequate recourse if they feel their oral question was not adequately answered, and subsequently proposes new recourse that does not currently exist in the standing orders. So let's first discuss if there are recourse options available to members. I will note that in 1964, this place debated recourse for members who felt their questions were not adequately addressed, and again from the Parliament of Canada website. In a review of the standing orders in 1964, the House adopted a procedure committee proposal for the first ever standing order to regulate question period. At that time, the House agreed to the committee's suggestion that a rule on adjournment proceedings be adopted to complement the question period standing order. This committee proposed a procedure whereby members who felt dissatisfied with an answer given the government to their question during question period could give notice that they wish to speak further on the subject matter of the question during the adjournment proceedings. And Mr. Speaker, at the start of this maximum 30-minute period, as you well know, from 6:30 p.m. to 7 p.m. on Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, a motion to adjourn the House is deemed to have been moved and seconded. No more than 3 brief exchanges are allowed on predetermined topics, and each of these topics may be debated at most 10 minutes of the 30-minute period set aside for adjournment proceedings. And no later than 5 p.m., the Speaker must tell the House which matter or matters are to be raised at that day. So, Mr. Speaker, certainly there are opportunities to follow up on question period, but I want to speak from my experience as a parliamentary secretary. I actually, and my staff may disagree with me, but I did enjoy adjournment proceedings. They allowed for a fuller expansion on the government position on an issue than the short time allowed for during question period, and oftentimes allowed for some personal engagement with one's opposition critic. Sometimes these proceedings became the nucleus for committee study, or provoked a minister to delve into a policy issue with more vigor. Sadly, adjournment proceedings are rarely reported on or followed by the Canadian media or by the public. I should also note, Mr. Speaker, that members frequently submit written questions via formal process to ministers, again from the Parliament of Canada websites. Provision allowing for written questions to be posed to the ministry have been included in the rules of the House of Commons since 1867. The rule, virtually identical to today's Standing Order 39-1, provided that questions could be asked of private members as well as ministers, although it appears that from the beginning, the practice saw questions directed only to ministers. That practice has continued to this day and has been periodically reinforced with additions to the Standing Order referring to the manner that answers are to be provided to order paper questions. In each case, questions to ministers appear to be assumed. While oral questions are posed without notice on matters deemed to be of an urgent nature, written questions are placed after notice on the order paper with the intent of seeking from the ministry detailed, lengthy, or technical information related to public affairs. So, Mr. Speaker, I do believe that recourse as it pertains to the proposal of today's motion does already exist, and as such, I do believe that today's motion is somewhat redundant. However, that said, I do believe that this proposed new recourse is worthy of debate. Earlier today, I believe that the leader of the Green Party said that the question period resembled high school theater. The government House leader responded with a point that the responses to question period are often set by tones of the questions. I think there are grains of truth in both of these statements, and why is this so? The press gallery, Mr. Speaker, is most populated during question period because QP gives sound bites for 140-character tweets and the evening newsreel. It's also the time when the House is most populated by members, as ministries are required to be represented to answer any question from any topic pertaining to government business. This indeed can be a recipe for theater. including borderline slanderous opposition statements, which wouldn't be made without the benefit of parliamentary immunity. And certainly there are times found throughout the Hansard since its genesis where government members have given a response which was hot under the collar or ill-advised. That said, in the majority of cases, members on both sides of this House strive to bring light and statesmanship rather than heat to question period. Many of my opposition critics care more for their files than making sensational, farcical statements at the start of their questions. And many of my ministerial colleagues are subject matter experts on their files and bring that depth of knowledge to their answers. Many of us here don't spend time away from friends and family for any other reason than to argue policy that will, in our minds, make Canada a better place. Unfortunately, these moments, which are frequent, don't make a provocative headline or tweet, and as such, I would argue that these instances are vastly underreported. Because this type of recourse has also been studied in previous parliaments, I'd like to discuss some of those findings. As today's debate has shades of a question of decorum, let me turn to previous studies undertaken on the same subject. Under Standing Order 10, the Speaker already has the power to preserve decorum. This power has been a duty of the Chair since 1867. The Speaker's responsibility to preserve decorum was a significant challenge in the early years of Confederation. In fact, speakers at that time were regularly confronted with rude and disorderly content which they were unable to control. This including the throwing of papers, books, and in one case, firecrackers. O'Brien and Bosk note that this disorderly behavior by members in the early years of Confederation may have been due to, and I quote, a much frequented public saloon, which plied intoxicating liquors to members seeking refreshment during lengthy evening debates. The saloon was closed in 1896, and O'Brien and Bosk note that in the early 20th century, it was more calmer and more austere. Mr. Speaker, a review of Bryan and Bosk also indicates that the current challenge of preserving decorum in the House has been an ongoing challenge since at least the 1950s and not unique to our time. These challenges have led to committee recommendations to enhance the power of Speaker to preserve decorum. For example, in 1985, the McGrath Committee recommended that the Speaker be empowered to order the withdrawal of a member for a remainder of the sitting. This power was included in the standing orders in 1986, and it is a power which indeed has been used. And in 1992, the Special Advisory Committee to the Speaker on Unparliamentary Language and the Speaker's authority to deal with breaches of decorum and behavior released its report dealing with decorum in the House of Commons. The report included a number of draft amendments to the standing, which it would have strengthened the Speaker's power to suspend sittings of the House and set out specific guidelines for the suspension of members. The revised standing orders would have provided for a range of suspension periods depending on the number of suspension imposed on a member, with a 20-day suspension period imposed for members having 3 or more suspensions. The amendments would have also allowed for suspensions from serving on committees and the loss of right of access to the parliamentary precinct. This report was never tabled in the House, nor were its recommendations implemented or formally debated. In the 39th Parliament, the Procedure and Health Affairs Committees also studied the issue of decorum in the House. The committee conducted its study in light of concerns raised by Canadians about noisy and boisterous behavior in the House, particularly during question period. The committee was tasked with revisiting the amendments to the standing orders proposed in 1992 by a special advisory to the Speaker. The committee heard from a number of highly respected witnesses, including the clerk and the former clerk of the House of Commons. And a witness noted that the lack of decorum and respect for the rules is not a new phenomenon, nor is this only an issue in the Canadian House of Commons. Mr. Speaker, how much time do I have left? Mr. Speaker, how much time do I have left? While the committee's report noted that the Speaker's powers under the standing orders to maintain decorum, the Speaker requires the cooperation and assistance of all members, Mr. Speaker, since the Speaker is the servant of the House and reflects the collective will of the Chamber. During this committee's hearings on decorum, witnesses urged the committee to proceed with caution in recommending rules-based changes to decorum. These witnesses noted that such changes could weaken the traditional authority of the Speaker with respect to decorum, which would be a fundamental change to House practices. And given these concerns, the committees came to the following conclusion. The existing power of the Speaker is extensive and encompasses a wide range of options. The committee urged the Speaker to exercise the full extent of his disciplinary powers firmly, forcefully, and fairly to improve decorum in the Chamber. And on this point, Mr. Speaker, our former Speaker Peter Milliken, noted in the Ottawa Citizen last week that adding new black letter rules may not be the most effective means of enforcing standards of decency. He relied upon the uncodified principle that one must catch the Speaker's eye to be called upon to address the House. And as he put it in the article, and I quote, "There was one member who used unparliamentary language. I asked him to withdraw the remarks, and he refused. I didn't kick him out because, in my view, that isn't any punishment. I told him that he wouldn't speak in the House until he apologized to the chair and withdrew his remarks, and he never did. He never spoke again for the rest of Parliament. A year and a bit, I think." End quote. Specifically on the content of replies and question period as it stands, O'Brien and Bosk note on page 510 that, quote, "The Speaker, however, is not responsible for the quality or content of replies to questions," end quote. This is based on a ruling of Speaker Gilbert Parent from October 9th, 1997. At that time, Speaker Parent had this to say: "With respect to all members of Parliament, I am not here to judge the quality of a question or the quality of an answer, Mr. Speaker. I am here to see to it that a question is properly put and that the minister, the government, or the person whom it is directed has a chance to answer. What the member is asking me to do is outside the purview of the Speaker. If that were the case, should I judge on the quality of all the questions in the House? I urge all honourable members to pose questions that will be of interest to most Canadians, or at least to a certain part of the country, perhaps a constituency where a specific answer is needed on something. I decline to ever judge on the quality of either a question or an answer," end quote. Mr. Speaker, and this is what I believe is at the heart of the matter in front of us today, and this is where I am trying to be as nonpartisan as possible, from the bottom of my heart. When I started this intervention here today, the knowledge of our roles of members of Parliament, as well as the choice of how we choose to execute, or not, those responsibilities, are each of our individual responsibilities. So, Mr. Speaker, to the core of the matter put forward here today, should this additional recourse be supported? Again, if civic engagement is a partnership between a member taking personal responsibility to provide thoughtful content in debate and the engagement of the electorate in the same, I would argue that further recourse proposed by the opposition in this motion isn't looking in the right place. Rather, we each, regardless of political stripe, need to look inward and to our constituents as the true source of accountability on how question period and debate here is governed. Thank you.
Question et commentaire, l'honorable député de Lac-Bathurst.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I'd like to thank the member, the Minister of State for Western Economic Divers. She has been here now for a little while. I listened to her speech, and I really enjoy it. She put lots of work in it. She done it by herself. She put lots of work in it, lots of information. But does she understand, though, that the House of Commons is for questioning the government? Does she understand that the government have the majority and they could make their decision? And this is the place to question the government. And if she listened to the speech of today, it looked like she did, because she said she heard what the leader of the government has thought about. He said that will take away them the right to question the opposition. Well, they had many years to question the government when they were in the opposition. And they're going to have lots of time next year. But right now, our parliament is the opposition question the government to keep them accountable to Canadians. And that's what the House leader was worried about. On top of it, he had a motion to put this question. He put the question. That means we will not probably be voting on the motion of the NDP. To me, it goes all against the democracy and the responsibility of this House.
The Honourable Minister of State.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to my honourable colleague who shares a former surname of mine. I welcome the question because it is an important one. I agree that question period is a time in which opposition members are to put questions to the government, and the government is to take that responsibility seriously. And many of us, Mr. Speaker, as I spoke about this, do. I remember my first experience in this House when I had to take questions on the file of the environment. Something that actually incented me to answer questions was the fact that the media took notice of the exchange between myself and the now deputy leader of the NDP. It was fun. And I actually think that to characterize all debate in this House as irrelevant is not true. And that was the point of the speech I'm trying to make. To my colleague across the way, certainly we have heard about beaver testicles and NDP questions. And certainly we all have times in this place where we're tired, the temperatures get high, we're away from our families, and we're human. But I think what we need to do today is, rather than talking about simply trying to legislate our responsibility in this place, is just take that upon ourselves. And that's the point that I'm trying to make, is that you can change the standing orders all you want, but each of us here is responsible for our own actions and our own behavior, and that is why we are gifted the responsibility to be members of Parliament.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Edmonton St. Albert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Honourable Minister for a great speech. I really enjoyed it. I do have a question, and I agree with her. It is up to the members of this House to take ownership of this House. If we look like buffoons, or if we look like we're disinterested on the TV cameras, that reflects badly not on only the individual who's in the camera shot, but on all of us. I think that we can all agree. But my question for her, and she made a good argument that order paper questions and late show proceedings or adjournment proceedings are a good avenue to pursue questions not answered in question period. But does she not agree that question period is the apex of the House of Commons day? It's when the media is watching, it's when the galleries are full, it's when the House is full, and that ought to be the time when the government, policing itself, ought to take ownership of the quality of answers.
The Honourable Minister of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, as I take the microphone out of my hair. I respectfully disagree. I do agree with the principle that question period is an important time in which members can question the government. I spoke about this. I spoke about the need to have respectful questions and well-informed answers. I agree. That said, I think that that's a very myopic view on the responsibility in this place. This place is woefully underpopulated at this point in time during the day. Some of the most important businesses facing our country comes in front of here at any point in time. So to say that the work that happens in committee, in debate during various stages here, or in the other place, doesn't have the same footing as question period, I disagree, and I certainly hope that the Canadian public and the media will also wake up to this point.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Minister for her speech. I know she's answered many questions in this House during question period, both as a Minister and previously as a Parliamentary Secretary. And what I've noticed in the question periods that I've witnessed in the 6 or so years that I've been here is that there's often a lot of repetition on the other side of the House. You'll get the same question asked over and over and over again, even if the when the minister makes a full answer, which perhaps refutes the accuracy of the question being asked, the next person will read the same talking points and ask the question again. It's like they don't even listen to the answer that the minister has given. This motion of the NDP, to me, Mr. Speaker, seems one-sided. It doesn't say anything about the repetition or relevance of the questions being asked. It just talks about the responses. I wonder if the minister could give us her thoughts on that.
The Honourable Minister of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I won't speak to the question period prep practices of any party in this House, but I will speak to this. You can tell the difference between someone who understands the core of their question and it's coming from their heart, and someone who understands the core of their answer and it's coming from a seat of knowledge, and someone who doesn't. We all have that across the party aisles here, are guilty of that, Mr. Speaker. And again, I think that this reinforces the point of personal accountability in this place. We're not always perfect. I'm not always perfect. But I think when we all try to strive to maintain this principle, this becomes a better place. And I would like to say, Mr. Speaker, that somehow this motion would completely reduce the theatre that is question period, but it wouldn't. That's up to each and every one of us. It's up to our party leadership. It's up to how we discuss, how we choose to answer questions, Mr. Speaker. So I think that this topic is actually needs to be given more respect and debate than just the core of the NDP's motion here today. Thank you.
Question et commentaire. L'honorable député de Beauport-Limoilou.
Monsieur le Président, je ne peux pas m'empêcher de relever le commentaire qu'a passé le secrétaire au ministre de la Justice Écoutez, Monsieur le Président, il n'y a rien de plus déplaisant que de voir un conservateur essayer de se poser en victime alors le parti détient la majorité des sièges en Chambre. Mais pour en revenir à la ministre d'État, je la remercie énormément pour son discours. En contrepartie, vous savez, Monsieur le Président, on se retrouve à être tous dépositaires des 308 députés ici à la Chambre, tous dépositaires d'une responsabilité de reddition de comptes vis-à-vis de nos commettants, en fait, de l'ensemble de la population canadienne. Et vous savez, Monsieur le Président, cette responsabilité-là est quand même difficile à assumer. C'est un défi et il ne faut pas se le cacher. Je rejoins la ministre d'État comme quoi la période des questions peut être aussi un point d'orgue côté émotion, trop plein émotionnel. Ceci étant, Monsieur le Président, il n'empêche que cette responsabilité-là doit être assumée aussi particulièrement par les représentants de l'exécutif, qui est quand même une branche particulière qui a une reddition de comptes à donner à cette Chambre. C'est une problématique qui a été souvent soulevée avec mes collègues élus dans d'autres pays, entre autres des pays africains. Alors, est-elle consciente de cette responsabilité particulière de l'exécutif?
The Honourable Minister of State.
You know, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to think we're coming to consensus on this topic. There's room for improvement. Each of us have our own responsibilities to do that, to take that improvement component on, Mr. Speaker. There are going to be times when it's hot under the collar here, at the end of our 4-week rotations. Stuff happens, but at the end of the day, I think if we all ingrain in every action that we do in here a respect for the electorate, and the electorate also engages back with us in good faith, we've actually done our job as a member of Parliament. So I don't disagree with what is being talked about here today, but I do disagree with what's being proposed to rectify it. I look forward to taking questions. Should anyone have any questions on Western economic diversification or taking late shows, Mr. Speaker? I enjoy debate here. Great, tomorrow. Mr. Speaker, I just really hope that we can acknowledge here that the Speaker is empowered to make choices, and that, again, I know I sound repetitive now, but I do think it's relevant, that it's up to us, each and every one of us, to elevate the debate here.